Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
USA, we're number one, but for how long? 2 years ago, a special president's commission that studied competitiveness in the industrial world warned the White House that, quote, our ability to compete in world markets is eroding, unquote. What are we doing about it? What should we do about it? Our panelists will address those questions and others today. They are Neil Palumba, who is Dean of the Ball State College of Business and a professor of economics, John Rouse, a professor of political science here at Ball State, and Bill Mosier, professor of marketing. Bill, what's the obsession with being number one? Is it important? The United States has this image of being the number one producer. Does it matter?
Oh, Larry, I really think it does. It may not matter as much as it's trumpeted and as much as it's touted and that sort of thing. I don't think there's any question that if you're not number one, we're going to see some significant changes in our economy structurally. For example, if you really lose your stature economically, then you're talking about a change in terms of the standard of living, potentially. And you're also looking at a reduction or a leveling of growth of jobs, and you're looking at a situation where you're really fighting competitively in terms of the financial markets and a lot of other things. Now, that doesn't mean that's all just immediately you have overwhelming effects, but it is a structural issue that is a very powerful issue in terms of the way we're accustomed to living and our role in the world markets. I think you could probably see, to me, somewhat of a microcosm by the way the world's looking right now at the value of the dollar. And there is very great concern that the United States is trying to be so aggressively competitive, and there is claims made by some that the United States is intentionally letting the value of the dollar drop very rapidly. The administration says no, but this is something that is healthy, that it is moving so that we're more competitive in the world markets. But I don't know that it's really anything that's just absolutely mandatory that we be in the position we are. This is something where it's hard to give up once you're there. I think that's the big issue.
Isn't this something that was going to happen with the emergence of other nations into industry and certainly the technology that's available elsewhere? Neil?
Yes, I think what we have here is a situation where, for a whole set of circumstances, the United States was the dominant, clearly and by far the dominant world economic power after World War II, leading into and after World War II, for a period of time. And when you're in that kind of position, when you are number one by a large amount, you become not inefficient, but you become less efficient. The examples go on and on and on, but you have protected markets, protected by government or protected by monopoly of your technology, which is going to take several years for others to catch up with. And during that period, it is easy to become accustomed to think, well, I'll be number one forever, or for 100 years, and for a long time, and to then get a little soft on the edges, to guarantee contracts, to give large wage increases, to share some of that. In economics, we would call it monopoly profit. The monopoly didn't come about, I think, because of collusion necessarily, but monopoly comes about many ways. One way you can have a monopoly is if your technology is so superior to everybody else's, to all your competitors, that until they catch up, you're going to earn big profits. Now, economic theory tells you that won't last forever. But while you're earning that, you then turn around and you share that with your workers. No U.S. company gave workers, I shouldn't say no, most of them didn't give them a share of profits. They didn't call it that. They just called them large wage increases, pension plans, health insurance, no deductible or low deductible, and on and on and on, and work rules. And you have, the workers 182 classification of workers. You agree to that. Why not? You're in a monopoly position. You're in a powerful position. You know if you don't share some of that wealth, the workers are going to be uneasy with you. Anyway, what has happened is that we have the natural forces of more competition coming in. What brought the U.S. to number one status is still here. I mean, not quite as strong, but I mean, it's still here. And we now just have to learn to be I shouldn't say learn, we have to resharpen our competition. We've got to get rid of some of these contracts. It's a quick example, a microcosm. When the railroads were dominant in transportation a long time ago, they signed very, very generous contracts with their workers. But little by little, the airplane industry came in, and cars came in, and trucking came in, and the interstate system, and the monopoly was broken. And what happened is, railroads have not really, well, the railroads are with us, will always be with us, but I mean, they've had to restructure their contracts, and it's a far more competitive situation.
Significant restructuring, really, in the railroad. Yeah. Unbelievable when you look at that. So that's a good example of what we may have to look at as a nation.
You know, I think there's several things we could look at. First of all, after World War II, we had a very unreal base in terms of economics. Politically, Western Europe had been destroyed, Japan had been destroyed, so we started off in the 1950s with a very unreal base in terms of competition.
Right.
So the political assumptions were very, very different then than they are now. I also think as we look at these systems that are mainly in competition with us, politically they are very authoritarian systems, systems where people more or less go along, whereas our system is very, very decentralized. And the third thing I would focus on, I focus upon President Reagan's address of a couple weeks ago, where he emphasized excellence and a phrase I would call civic education. So the public policy issue from a political point of view is how do we get the American people to think more in terms of long-range planning, I would think, and not short-range planning. Everything that we seem to have in this country will focus upon short-range political gains or losses. And until we come to some sort of sense in terms of a planned public policy, we will probably have these kinds of discontinuations.
Neil, you talked about changing these contracts, changing conditions. Does it boil down to our labor costs are just too high?
It's not that simple. It's really not that simple. That's part of the mix.
A big part?
A significant part. But I will not, you know, I really don't think it's not, if it was that simple, we would simply have to either negotiate with the unions or have a public policy that we just force the unions to renegotiate their contracts or face extinction. I mean, unions exist in a democracy because of the will of the democracy. I mean, they exist for many reasons, but without the federal government allowing them to exist, they don't exist. If that was the only problem, we would take care of that very quickly, we as a nation. That is a part of the problem. I still think what has happened is I like to use the analogy, I grew up at a period where I loved to go to movies on Saturday, and they were either Western movies or fighting movies, boxing movies, and I'm exaggerating, but in every boxing movie I ever saw as a kid, when something like this, the young guy comes along and is tough and mean, and he wants to be the champ, and he works hard, and he becomes the champ, then he meets the wrong girl, and then he gets in with the wrong people, and he gets fat, and he gets sloppy, and he loses. And then he either dies or wins again or something. It always ended differently, but that was the story. And that's too simple a story, of course, but I mean, what I'm saying is that it is a natural ebb and flow of societies and of economies and of institutions of all and of people to, if you have the ability to get to the top, once there, it is not definite that you're going to soften or weaken, but that's, I think we have to, the unions are going to come along. The unions are going to come along or face extinction, and that's all there is to it. They're declining sharply. They know it. They're either going to disappear in this country or negotiate. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to take 50 cents an hour pay. I mean, they couldn't live. You and I, none of us could live on 50 cents an hour or $2 an hour in this country, so they can't, they're not the whole problem. And indeed, any rigidities there, I'm sure, will come along. Where I'd like to get at, coming back to public policy John was talking about, and this is a little bit self-serving, let me say that right up front, truth in advertising, but I think, one, we got to leave the major decisions on investment in the private sector. Our decentralization of our economy is still a great strength. But we are still, as a nation, we've gotten away with this. We've gotten away with being sloppy with our education system and educational support and research support. But the fact of the matter is, the United States is a capitalist, decentralized economy, and that's very strong. But on top of that, You have to have some basic education investment and basic research investment. The research is not only done at universities, that's the self-serving part, but I'm talking about primary education, secondary education, higher education, research labs. And I'm not talking about, totally, doubling or tripling that budget. Those are very large budgets. But I'm talking about getting our percentage of the GMP that goes to basic research a little bit higher than we've been doing. We've gotten a little sloppy, in my opinion. Let's come to Indiana. Indiana is not the problem. Indiana is not, at the center of our problems. But the state of Indiana, I think, is facing the education system. Now, with the proposals that are on the table right now, maybe they won't all be passed. Maybe not all of them should be passed. But every one of our states and the U.S. as a whole should be thinking about getting more out of the dollars we put into education and getting some more dollars into special programs with the promise of evaluation of what you get for those dollars. So, yes, union contracts are part of it, but I go right, in my opinion, I say keep the capitalistic system, but then what the U.S. government has always done is impose on that system a tax structure and impose on that system certain basic research and basic education programs, and we've gotten a little sloppy with that. Maybe we got to shift our money around a little bit. Some things we need, maybe we can take money from someplace else. Some other things we might need some new money. If we need some new money, we're going to have to look at our tax system.
You raise a couple points. First of all, labor unions don't have as much influence as they used to, but perhaps we could look at it this way. If an organization does not change, it will indeed go out of existence. Right. So, in a sense, we could say that labor unions got everything they wanted, and so they had it passed into law, so they have nothing else to get in a way. However, labor is not going to disappear. I mean, you can talk about labor unions, and then you can talk about labor, so labor's not going to disappear. Okay, the next point. Ross Perot, who is a macro business person, whatever he does, he had this proposal. He says what you should do in terms of the folks that run our large corporations, you should not pay them cash, but you should pay them according to in stocks and so forth. So if their company does well, they get paid more. If it doesn't do so well, they get paid less.
Right.
So there's no correlation between making profits sometimes and having good management. So it seems in terms of education, as the human problems come way after the technical ones, we can have all this fancy television things in terms of teaching. If you don't follow with the human problems, you're going to still be very, very inefficient.
Right. Let me add on that education thing that you mentioned, the Perot proposal. I don't know the genesis of this proposal, but when I was a new assistant professor a long time ago, somebody told me about this proposal. I don't know where it came from. It's semi-joke, and you'll know what I mean in a second. And the idea was to get more out of our education system, but you could apply this everywhere. You could apply this to newspapers. You could apply it to industry. You name it. But to get more out of your professors, what we should do is tell them, you will be paid at the end of your work life according to what you have achieved in teaching, research, and service. Not at the end of each year, the end of your work life. Now, you know this can't be done, but and the interesting part was that then everyone, the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker, would all have to advance you against the promise of payment later on. And so the idea was that if you had a poor year, if your teaching wasn't up to snuff that year, if your research wasn't up to snuff, every time you went to the grocery store, the grocer would look at you and say, well, I've heard that your teaching is a little off. At the end of your work life, you might not get paid too much. You won't pay my bill. Well, obviously, the proposal was you could never be done in that format. But what the proposal gets to is that in education, in research, and in all the major industries, and certainly that we're looking for ways to tie. We will invest this money into this system. What are we going to get? We, the nation, we, the state of Indiana, if it's the Indiana state. But what are we going to get, and how do we evaluate that, and how do we tie rewards to, without, of course, doing this lifetime thing?
If the business sector insists, as I think they probably should in a way, to have the decisions made in the private sector, isn't the onus upon business to come up with better ways of managing so labor can be more self-fulfilled in this day and time? And I mean,
I think it's all of our jobs. I think it's a business job to do that. I think unions, if they wish to exist, by the way, I think unions will exist 20, 30 years from now and will be effective, not control the economy, but effective. But if that's to be true, they're going to have to play a role. And I think education, I go back to education, I really do believe I think we do a good job in education, but certainly we can do better. We can be more responsible. We may need more resources to do more, and we're going to have to then demonstrate what we are doing for that
But of course, education is not just a segmented kind of thing. I mean, you just don't focus on education. Education is throughout the system, and you have to focus upon education in business, education in other ways of life. You know, one of the things that we face in political science is that kids don't know history, so and kids don't know politics oftentimes. Perhaps they know the meaning of the year 1787 now. It's only because this is the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. But until we have a very key focus upon civic education, my point is that education is not just something for the secondary schools and the high schools and the colleges. Education is all over the place.
You're saying it's broad and it's long term.
It
takes a long time to accomplish it.
But if it's not all the way, I mean, why does business and so many groups say, hey, school teachers, you solve the problem, and then everything's going to be all right? I mean, the family says the same thing. I mean, what has happened in the last 25 years, as far as public policy is concerned, is that the schools have to solve every problem that we have in society.
Well, no, I
mean, the family has abdicated. Other groups are not involved.
Well, but I think education, I think what Neil's saying is education, like you're saying, is far broader, and we're not just talking about education in schools. In business, people now, the only way people will advance in businesses today in the professional position is if they go back and they go to seminars, if they continue their education. The need for continuous education is far greater than it was even 5 years ago, I think, because of the repetitive change. And I think that really ties in with some of the things that you're talking about there, because I think one of the key issues on the union question was what is happening to productivity. In other words, the wages are not a problem if you get improvements in productivity. And we still have not done that particularly well. Okay, we look at what Neil said about the issue of research and development. In other words, spending dollars there. You're not going to have improvements in productivity if you don't either have better technology or if you don't teach people to work smarter and more efficiently. And so I see that as being part of this very broad issue. But I think we have to recognize this is structural, this is long-term. It's not something that somebody pumps money in and it happens tomorrow. And we have a real problem in this country because we want to see results now.
And of course, education is not considered to be esoteric. I mean, education is something that helps us cope in our jobs in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, in terms of allowing us to improve our skills and to do better and to respond so we can have a higher standard of living. But I'd raise one issue. I'm not so certain that the American people want to maintain a high standard of living.
They may not want to badly enough right now.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure politically that the American people have the political will to maintain a high standard of living.
I'm not sure.
I certainly hope I'm wrong on that,
well,
but I'm concerned about that.
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but I would say I think we have the will to continue to be competitive. I won't even say to be competitive again, to continue to be competitive. We'll never have, I don't think in our lifetime we'll ever have that convergence of forces that make our technology across the board, ours being the U.S. technology across the board, not only number one, but lead everybody else. The game has changed and the competition is getting sharper and sharper. But I think our will is there to compete, and I think we will. It's tough to go from way out and leading in the pack down to closer to the pack, and you run it either way you want. It's not so much that we fell; it's everybody else is caught up.
In a matter of productivity, isn't it different? Isn't it relative? But it's different in different industries.
Very, very definitely.
Shouldn't we be more selective in what it is we produce and how much of it we produce? For example, we're no longer the most efficient automaker in the world. We're perhaps not the most efficient steel producer in the world. Are these areas where we shouldn't, in some cases, try to compete with people like the Japanese who might be more efficient?
Well, I think I really agree with you on that, Larry, as far as we should be looking realistically at where the opportunity is in the future. And that's something where maybe we should be more in information technology, but I think we also are things of this nature. Maybe we should be more in other types of industries rather than what we've traditionally done, which is basic production. And I think you can see the example or the parallel because the Japanese basically backed away from their steel production and they basically sold their facilities off to third world nations that, hey, the future's in computers. And they already have said, we don't want to go back, we're going to look forward. And maybe we need to do that more effectively.
Yeah, but this thing also has a political implication because although it might be in our economic best interest not to make cars, but we have to make tanks. Or we don't want to depend upon the Japanese to supply us all of our cars. So you have a national security issue here, and so we have to be prepared in a military sense. So we might have to have that reconversion from automobiles to tanks. In any case, we have to be careful in terms of the political position because, number one, we do not want to depend upon the Japanese for our automobiles exclusively.
But will we be producing tanks because of the change in technology? The war may, if there were something like that, some battle, it may be completely.
But I think in terms of a political decision, I think the country's going to make a decision to stay in the game of producing automobiles.
Well, it gets even more complicated than that, as we all know. I don't think it's a situation of us going in or out of a certain industry. What it is that each of those industries we've just mentioned as examples are probably, I have no idea, but let's say 150 different specialty items, and that number may be a little large and maybe a little small. What I'm trying to say is, yeah, we're not going to get out of auto production, in my opinion, but we are going to lop off whole areas of auto production. The way take a university can have 300 majors. Ball State University probably has 120, and if we at Ball State tried to have 300, we would be terrible. We would be very, very ineffective. We would take our fairly nice, what looks like a nice budget to you or me as an individual, $100 million is a lot of money, and we would spread it over 300 majors, and we would be not second class, but third class. We would be incompetent across the board. On the other hand, if we only had 2 majors or 3 majors, we'd be wasteful, because we would be funded way above. So we think, and maybe we should have more, maybe we should have less, but we're trying, and each institution tries to get a different mix. The auto industry, I'm confident, and I may be wrong, but I am confident that we will find our special niches in that industry. And again, that's the hard part of it. When you were dominant across the board, when your mistakes even were successful almost, it's so hard to stop and say, hey, I can't do that anymore. I now got to get leaner. What does leaner and meaner mean? It really means I've got to look at this whole array, this industry, which is never simple, which is highly complex. I've got to look at 50 items or 100 items or 500 items, and I've got to pick the 3 dozen that I'm best at, or the 5 dozen, and I've got to give up some of the others. And then some of the others, I don't have to give them up, but I have to assemble them here, and the parts are made elsewhere. Or maybe I'll have to assemble them in Mexico and bring them in. And then, of course, then there's political problem. And, it's a whole very mixed. That's why I think we're in a very strong, we being the United States are in a strong position because of our decentralized economy to make those kinds of decisions quickly. Where we have gotten a little sloppy, in my opinion, is we've been a little sloppy with our investment, with our basic research, and basic research always comes from the society. The U.S. government set up the education system. The U.S. government sets up the roads. The U.S. government sets up the training, basic training programs. Business has to do a lot of it, but you can't expect General Motors to build all the roads in the United States, to build all the tanks, to build all the cars, and to build all the grammar schools and high schools. Of course not. The infrastructure, that famous word, the infrastructure has got to come from the federal government and state government. And again, I'm returning to the state of Indiana. I'm really pleased to see our governor and our General Assembly struggling with the education. Obviously, one can say, well, of course you're pleased, you depend on that, and yes, that's true. But I know I'm pleased as a citizen to see us struggling with that and trying to make the system more competitive.
What new things is management doing to be more creative, to make workers more productive?
Why I can't list 1,000 examples.
I think probably it's not a totally brand new thing, but it's being used a lot more, and that's a lot more profit sharing is a good example of something that they're doing, because then there's a tremendous increase in the amount of companies that are legitimately using this rather than just a token situation. Lincoln Welding is a classic example where the corporation is very, very successful, but the profit-sharing program is so successful that they just have an unbelievable number of people waiting to work for that firm. In other words, people there, they don't want any sort of organization, unionization, whatever, because they see it can be compatible with the union situation, but they see an opportunity to advance based on their own input. And I think it takes something of this nature, in addition to possibly training or technology, but it has to be something where the people involved see something back for what they're putting into that.
We also see, let me just very quickly just say, we also seeing companies going under. Some fairly, well, the airline industry, which is a special example, so let's not dwell on it too much, but, you know, what is it, the largest airline today did not exist 10 years ago, and I may have that number slightly off, and I know it's the largest by mergers. The banking industry, I mean, when I was a kid, the banking industry was one of the most stable industries in the world, probably, and I do not have the exact numbers here, but a few years ago we had 15,000 banks in the United States, and now project that we'll have 10,000 or 8,000 a few years from now. Now that doesn't mean banking is going to be better. And again, banking and airlines, these are just specific examples. No, I see. The nice thing about a decentralized economy is those managers that are not doing the right things, they're going to pay a price. They can be just protected. So I don't know of any major industries that are really protected anymore, but I interrupted. You were going to add to that.
He didn't have time to add to that. The one thing we are out of now is time, and I want to thank our panelists, John Rouse, Neil Paloma, and Bill Mosier for their time and commentary here today. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.